There is a voice within you that never rests. It speaks in silence, in reaction, in doubt, and in hope. Most people hear it, but very few truly listen. This voice is not just passing noise. It is the architect of your inner world. And your inner world, whether you realize it or not, is the foundation of your outer life. When this voice is harsh, critical, and unforgiving, it creates division within you. One part of you becomes the judge, and the other becomes the condemned. Over time, this internal conflict weakens your spirit. It drains your energy, clouds your decisions, and shapes a reality filled with hesitation and fear. But something remarkable happens when you begin to change the way you speak to yourself. Not through empty positivity or forced affirmations, but through conscious awareness. When you observe your inner dialogue without judgment, you begin to understand its patterns. You start to see that many of these thoughts are not truly yours. They are inherited, conditioned, absorbed from past experiences and expectations. The transformation begins the moment you choose to respond differently. Instead of saying, "I am not enough," you pause and say, "I am becoming." Instead of "I always fail," you say, "I am learning through every attempt." Instead of attacking yourself, you begin to guide yourself. This shift may seem small, but it changes everything, because the unconscious listens. It does not argue, it absorbs. And what it absorbs, it expresses through your behavior, your emotions, and your perception of the world. When your inner voice becomes supportive yet honest, firm yet compassionate, you create alignment within yourself. There is no longer a battle between who you are and who you think you should be. Instead, there is cooperation. And from that cooperation emerges strength that feels natural, not forced. You must understand this. The parts of you that you reject do not disappear. They retreat into the shadows, where they grow stronger and influence you without your awareness. But when you speak to yourself with understanding, even your darkest aspects begin to integrate. They lose their power to control you unconsciously. This is not about becoming perfect. It is about becoming whole. Your inner voice should not be your enemy. It should be your guide, your witness, your quiet source of truth. It should challenge you when you drift, but never destroy you in the process. It should remind you of your potential without denying your reality. Speak to yourself as someone responsible for your own growth. Speak with clarity. Speak with intention. Speak with respect. Because the way you talk to yourself is not just a habit, it is a force. A force that shapes your identity, your actions, and ultimately your destiny. Change that voice and you will not just change your thoughts. You will change your life. The way you speak to yourself shapes your unconscious reality in ways that are often subtle yet profoundly decisive. Every thought you repeat internally becomes a quiet instruction to the deeper layers of your mind, and these layers do not question, debate, or resist what is given to them consistently. Instead, they absorb, organize, and express it through your emotions, reactions, and behaviors. If your inner dialogue is filled with doubt, criticism, and limitation, your unconscious begins to construct a reality that reflects those patterns. It filters experiences to confirm what you already believe, reinforcing a cycle that feels natural but is in truth conditioned. This is why many people feel trapped not by external circumstances, but by the silent narrative running within them. The unconscious does not distinguish between truth and repetition, it only recognizes familiarity. What you say to yourself repeatedly becomes what feels real, and what feels real begins to guide how you act, what you pursue, and what you avoid. Over time, this internal language forms the architecture of your identity, shaping not only how you see yourself, but how you interpret the world around you. A single self-critical thought may seem harmless, but when repeated, it becomes a lens through which all experiences are judged. Failures appear more significant, successes feel undeserved, and opportunities are approached with hesitation. In contrast, when your inner dialogue shifts toward awareness and intentionality, the unconscious begins to reorganize itself around a different set of assumptions. This is not about denying difficulty or pretending everything is positive. It is about speaking to yourself in a way that acknowledges reality without surrendering to limitation. When you replace "I cannot handle this" with "I am learning to face this," you are not simply changing words, you are altering the internal blueprint that guides your response to challenge. The unconscious begins to register resilience instead of defeat, possibility instead of restriction. This shift influences how you carry yourself, how you make decisions, and how you respond under pressure. The body reflects it, the tone of your voice reflects it, and others begin to respond to you differently, not because they have changed, but because you have. The inner dialogue becomes a form of quiet conditioning that either strengthens or fragments your sense of self. When it is fragmented, there is conflict, hesitation, and self-sabotage. When it is aligned, there is clarity, direction, and a sense of grounded confidence that does not rely on external validation. The unconscious thrives on consistency, so the key is not occasional positivity, but disciplined awareness of what you repeatedly tell yourself. Each thought becomes a small imprint, and over time these imprints accumulate into a powerful internal structure that defines your lived experience. By becoming conscious of this process, you begin to take responsibility for the language you use within, recognizing that it is not neutral or insignificant, but deeply formative. The voice within you is always active, always shaping, always influencing, whether you are aware of it or not. And when you begin to guide it with intention, you are no longer being shaped unconsciously, but participating in the creation of your own psychological reality in a dialogue. Either fragments or integrates the psyche in ways that determine whether a person lives in quiet conflict or inner coherence. Beneath the surface of everyday awareness, there are multiple aspects of the self, each carrying different desires, fears, memories, and tendencies. These parts are not inherently in opposition, yet they often become divided through the language one uses internally. When the inner voice is harsh, condemning, or dismissive, it creates separation between these parts. One aspect takes on the role of authority, while another is reduced to something inadequate or unworthy. This dynamic produces tension that is not always visible but constantly felt, leading to confusion, hesitation, and a sense of being pulled in different directions without clarity. Fragmentation does not occur suddenly. It is the result of repeated patterns of self-talk that reject certain emotions, deny certain impulses, or suppress certain truths. When a person says to themselves that they should not feel a particular way, or that a part of them is unacceptable, that part does not disappear. It withdraws from conscious awareness and continues to exist beneath the surface, influencing thoughts and behaviors indirectly. The psyche becomes divided between what is acknowledged and what is hidden, and this division weakens the sense of inner stability. Decisions become inconsistent because they are influenced by forces that are not fully understood, and reactions become disproportionate because they are driven by unresolved internal tensions. On the other hand, integration begins when the inner dialogue shifts from judgment to awareness. Instead of rejecting or silencing parts of the self, the individual begins to observe them with curiosity and honesty. This does not mean agreeing with every impulse or acting on every feeling, but it does mean recognizing their presence without immediate condemnation. When a person says, "This is what I feel and I am willing to understand it," they create space for the psyche to come into alignment. The previously rejected parts begin to emerge into consciousness, where they can be examined, understood, and gradually integrated into a more unified sense of self. This process requires discipline because the tendency to judge is often deeply ingrained. The inner critic may have developed as a way to maintain control or avoid vulnerability, but over time it becomes a source of division. By consciously altering the tone of inner dialogue, the individual transforms this critic into a more constructive force. Instead of attacking, it begins to guide. Instead of dividing, it begins to connect. The psyche responds to this shift by reducing internal resistance, allowing different aspects of the self to cooperate rather than compete. Integration does not eliminate complexity. A person remains multifaceted with contrasting thoughts and emotions. The difference lies in how these elements relate to one another. In a fragmented state, they clash and create confusion. In an integrated state, they coexist and contribute to a deeper sense of understanding. The individual becomes more grounded because there is less internal opposition and more internal communication. Choices become clearer, not because life is simpler, but because the inner landscape is no longer divided against itself. The language used within plays a central role in shaping this outcome. Every statement made internally either reinforces separation or encourages unity. Over time, these statements form patterns that influence how the psyche organizes itself. By becoming aware of this process and intentionally guiding inner dialogue toward understanding rather than rejection, a person begins to move from fragmentation toward integration, creating a state of inner coherence that supports clarity, resilience, and a more stable sense of identity. Shadow listens to every word you say within, absorbing not only what you express openly, but also what you attempt to deny, suppress, or ignore. It is the silent observer of your inner dialogue, the hidden aspect of the psyche that carries everything you have pushed away in order to maintain a certain image of yourself. While it remains out of direct awareness, it is far from inactive. It responds, adapts, and grows based on the tone and content of your internal language, shaping your reactions in ways that often seem mysterious or uncontrollable. When your inner dialogue is filled with rejection, shame, or harsh judgment, the shadow does not disappear. Instead, it becomes more concentrated. The parts of yourself that you label as unacceptable are pushed deeper into the unconscious, where they gather intensity. Over time, this intensity begins to express itself indirectly. It may appear as sudden anger, unexplained anxiety, irrational fears, or patterns of self-sabotage that seem disconnected from your conscious intentions. These are not random occurrences, but reflections of what has been neglected within. The shadow listens to the words you use against yourself and interprets them as confirmation that it must remain hidden, reinforcing the divide between what you show and what you conceal. However, the dynamic changes when your inner dialogue shifts toward awareness and responsibility. When you begin to speak to yourself with honesty rather than avoidance, the shadow no longer needs to operate entirely in secrecy. Acknowledging uncomfortable thoughts or emotions does not give them control. It gives you the opportunity to understand their origin and influence. The shadow, in this sense, is not an enemy to be eliminated, but a part of the psyche that seeks recognition. It responds not to suppression, but to conscious engagement. Every word you direct inward carries weight because it signals how you relate to yourself as a whole. If your language is dismissive, the shadow becomes defensive. If your language is curious and grounded, the shadow begins to reveal its contents in a way that can be integrated. This process requires a willingness to face aspects of yourself that may not align with your ideal self-image. It requires you to question the narratives you have accepted about what is acceptable and what must be hidden. Through this questioning, the inner dialogue becomes a bridge rather than a barrier. The influence of the shadow can be seen in the patterns that repeat in your life. Situations that trigger disproportionate reactions often point to something unresolved within. These reactions are not merely responses to external events, they are expressions of internal material seeking acknowledgement. By paying attention to the way you speak to yourself in these moments, you gain insight into the relationship you have with your shadow. Are you condemning what arises, or are you attempting to understand it without losing control? As this awareness deepens, the inner dialogue begins to transform. It becomes less about control and more about integration. The shadow, once hidden and disruptive, gradually becomes a source of insight and strength. The energy that was previously tied up in suppression becomes available for conscious use, contributing to a more complete and balanced sense of self. The shadow listens continuously, responding to every internal statement as a form of instruction. By choosing your words with intention and grounding them in awareness rather than rejection, you begin to change the way this hidden aspect of the psyche interacts with your conscious mind, allowing what was once fragmented to move toward a more unified and coherent inner reality. Awareness transforms negative self-talk into conscious power by bringing what is automatic into the light of deliberate understanding. Most negative self-talk operates beneath conscious attention, repeating patterns that were formed through past experiences, conditioning, and unresolved emotions. These thoughts often appear as immediate reactions, quick judgments about oneself that feel true simply because they are familiar. Without awareness, they pass unquestioned, shaping perception and behavior in subtle but persistent ways. They influence how challenges are interpreted, how failures are internalized, and how possibilities are either embraced or avoided. When awareness enters this process, something shifts fundamentally. Instead of being carried by the momentum of habitual thinking, you begin to observe it. This observation creates a distance between you and the thought itself. In that space, the thought loses its authority. It is no longer an absolute statement about reality, but a pattern that can be examined. This is where transformation begins, not by forcefully rejecting negative thoughts, but by recognizing them as constructs rather than truths. Negative self-talk often carries an emotional charge because it is tied to deeper layers of the psyche. It may echo past criticism, internalized expectations, or unresolved fears. When left unconscious, it reinforces a sense of limitation, convincing you that certain outcomes are inevitable, Awareness interrupts this cycle by asking a simple but powerful question: is this thought accurate, or is it conditioned? This question alone weakens the automatic nature of negativity and opens the possibility for a different response. As you continue to observe your inner dialogue, patterns begin to reveal themselves. You notice recurring themes, specific triggers, and the tone in which you speak to yourself. This recognition is not meant to create further judgment, but to establish clarity. With clarity, you gain the ability to respond rather than react. Instead of immediately accepting a negative thought, you can choose to reframe it in a way that is grounded in reality but not confined by limitation. For example, a thought such as "I am incapable" may arise in moments of difficulty. Without awareness, it shapes behavior by encouraging withdrawal or avoidance. With awareness, it is seen as a reaction rather than a fact. It can then be transformed into something more constructive, such as "I am facing something unfamiliar and I can learn through it." This shift does not deny the challenge but changes the relationship you have with it. The unconscious begins to register adaptability instead of defeat, gradually altering how you respond in similar situations. This process requires consistency because the unconscious mind is shaped through repetition. A single moment of awareness can create insight, but sustained awareness creates change. Each time you consciously redirect negative self-talk, you reinforce a different internal pattern. Over time, these new patterns begin to replace the old ones, not through suppression, but through gradual reorganization. Conscious power emerges from this alignment between awareness and intention. It is not the absence of negative thoughts, but the ability to engage with them without being controlled by them. You become less reactive and more deliberate, less fragmented and more integrated. The energy that was once consumed by internal conflict becomes available for growth, creativity, and purposeful action. Awareness does not eliminate difficulty or uncertainty, but it changes how you meet them. It allows you to see that your inner dialogue is not a fixed reality, but a dynamic process that can be shaped. By consistently bringing attention to the way you speak to yourself and choosing language that reflects possibility rather than limitation, you begin to transform what was once an unconscious pattern into a conscious force that supports clarity, resilience, and a deeper sense of self-direction. Through change begins when the inner voice becomes an ally rather than an adversary, because the relationship you have with yourself determines the direction and consistency of your growth. For many, the inner voice develops as a critic, sharp, impatient, and often unforgiving. It attempts to correct, control, and protect, but in doing so, it creates tension within the psyche. One part of you strives forward while another pulls back with doubt and judgment. This internal opposition drains energy and weakens resolve, making change feel difficult even when the desire for it is strong. When the inner voice shifts into an ally, the dynamic within the psyche transforms. This does not mean the voice becomes passive or overly comforting. An ally does not ignore flaws or avoid truth. Instead, it speaks with clarity, firmness, and intention, guiding rather than condemning. It recognizes mistakes without turning them into identity. It acknowledges fear without allowing it to dictate action. This shift creates a sense of internal support that strengthens your ability to move forward even in uncertainty. The process of turning the inner voice into an ally begins with awareness of its current tone. Many people are unaware of how harsh or limiting their internal dialogue has become because it feels familiar. It operates automatically, repeating phrases that may have originated from past experiences or external influences. By observing this voice without immediately reacting to it, you begin to see that it is not an inherent truth, but a pattern that has been reinforced over time. Once this pattern is recognized, the possibility of change emerges. Instead of silencing the inner voice, you begin to reshape it. When it criticizes, you question the intention behind the criticism. When it predicts failure, you examine whether that prediction is based on evidence or fear. This approach transforms the voice from a source of resistance into a source of guidance. It begins to provide feedback that is constructive rather than destructive, focused on growth rather than limitation. An allied inner voice creates consistency in action because it reduces internal conflict. When you decide to pursue something challenging, there is no longer a competing narrative telling you to stop or withdraw. Doubt may still arise, but it is met with reasoning rather than panic. The voice becomes a stabilizing force, helping you maintain direction even when external circumstances are uncertain. This stability is essential for lasting change as it allows you to persist through discomfort without losing clarity. Over time, this supportive inner dialogue reshapes how you perceive yourself. Instead of identifying with past failures or perceived weaknesses, you begin to see yourself as someone capable of learning and adapting. This shift in perception influences behavior in subtle but powerful ways. You become more willing to take risks, more resilient in the face of setbacks, and more grounded in your decisions. The change is not sudden but cumulative, built through repeated moments of conscious self-guidance. The transformation also extends to how you relate to others and the world around you. When your inner voice is aligned and supportive, you rely less on external validation. You are less reactive to criticism and more open to feedback because your sense of direction comes from within. This internal alignment creates a presence that is steady and self-assured, not because challenges have disappeared, but because you are no longer divided against yourself. True change is not driven by force or external pressure, but by this internal cooperation. The moment your inner voice begins to guide rather than oppose, you establish a foundation for growth that is sustainable and grounded. Each thought, each response, and each decision becomes part of a larger pattern of alignment, gradually shaping a life that reflects not conflict, but a deeper sense of inner unity and purposeful movement. Self-respect is built through disciplined, intentional inner speech, because the way you address yourself determines the standard by which you live. It is not created through external validation or occasional moments of confidence, but through a consistent inner tone that reflects awareness, responsibility, and self-regard. Many people attempt to build self-respect by changing their circumstances, achievements, or appearance, yet overlook the quiet dialogue that runs beneath all of these efforts. This dialogue either reinforces a sense of worth or slowly erodes it through subtle but repeated patterns of dismissal and criticism. Discipline in inner speech does not mean suppressing negative thoughts or forcing artificial positivity. It means becoming aware of what you say to yourself and choosing your words with intention rather than habit. The undisciplined mind reacts automatically, often repeating phrases shaped by past experiences, failures, or external judgments. These reactions may seem insignificant in isolation, but over time they accumulate, forming a narrative that defines how you see yourself. When this narrative is inconsistent or self-defeating, it weakens your ability to trust your own decisions and commitments. Intentional inner speech introduces a different approach. It requires you to pause before accepting a thought as truth and to examine whether it aligns with the person you are trying to become. When you speak to yourself with clarity and respect, you establish an internal standard that influences your actions. For example, instead of saying, "I lack discipline," you might say, "I am learning to act with consistency." This shift does not ignore shortcomings, but frames them in a way that encourages growth rather than resignation. The unconscious mind begins to register this tone as a directive, gradually aligning behavior with the message it receives repeatedly. Self-respect grows when there is consistency between what you say to yourself and how you act. If your inner dialogue encourages responsibility, you are more likely to follow through on your commitments. If it reinforces avoidance or doubt, you are more likely to hesitate. The connection between thought and action becomes clearer as awareness increases, revealing that self-respect is not an abstract concept, but a lived experience shaped by daily patterns of thinking and behavior. There is also a level of honesty required in disciplined inner speech. Respecting yourself does not mean ignoring flaws or avoiding difficult truths. It means addressing them directly without reducing your entire identity to them. When you make a mistake, the inner voice can either diminish you or guide you. A disciplined voice acknowledges the error, examines its cause, and redirects your focus toward improvement. This approach maintains dignity while still allowing for growth, preventing the cycle of shame that often leads to stagnation. Over time, intentional inner speech creates a stable sense of identity. You begin to trust yourself not because you are perfect, but because you are consistent in how you relate to your own thoughts and actions. This trust becomes the foundation of self-respect, influencing how you set boundaries, pursue goals, and respond to challenges. External circumstances may change, but the internal standard remains steady, providing a sense of direction that is not easily disrupted. The process requires patience because deeply ingrained patterns do not shift immediately. There will be moments when old habits of thinking reappear, but discipline lies in returning to awareness and choosing a different response each time. These repeated choices gradually reshape the inner dialogue, turning it into a source of strength rather than conflict. As this transformation continues, self-respect becomes less dependent on outcomes and more rooted in the way you conduct yourself internally. The words you use within begin to reflect a sense of alignment between your values and your actions, reinforcing a cycle where intentional thought leads to consistent behavior, and consistent behavior strengthens the respect you hold for yourself over time.